Venezuela could be the point of no return. Let me take you back to July 28, 2024, not because it was the day Nicolas Maduro claimed victory in Venezuela's presidential election, but because of what happened in the hours and days that followed. The official results, announced by the National Electoral Council, declared Maduro the winner with 51% of the vote, a razor-thin margin over opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez. The United States, the European Union, and a chorus of Latin American governments immediately rejected the results as fraudulent. The State Department called it a sham. The Organization of American States demanded a full audit. And within 48 hours, the first whispers of something far bigger began circulating in Washington, Brussels, and Moscow. At first glance, this looks like just another election dispute in a country that has spent the last decade teetering on the edge of collapse. But here's what most people aren't: Venezuela is no longer just a failed state. It's the front line of a new Cold War, a proxy battleground where the rules of engagement are being rewritten in real time. And if we're not careful, it could be the place where the United States and its adversaries cross a threshold from which there is no peaceful return. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of geopolitics and resource competition, and I can tell you Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela anymore. It's about oil. It's about the dollar. It's about the future of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And most dangerously, it's about whether the world's great powers still believe in the idea of deterrence, or whether they've decided that the time for restraint is over. Let's start with the official narrative, the one you've been hearing in the press. The story goes like Maduro, a dictator clinging to power, rigged an election to avoid the fate of his predecessors in the region, men like Bolivia's Evo Morales or Brazil's Dilma Rousseff, who were removed from office through democratic or semi-democratic means. The Venezuelan people, exhausted by hyperinflation, mass emigration, and chronic shortages, turned out in record numbers to vote for change. When the government announced Maduro's victory, the streets erupted in protest. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, a hardline anti-Chavista who was barred from running, claimed that their own tally showed Gonzalez winning by a landslide. The international community, led by the U.S., condemned the election as illegitimate. And now, the argument goes, the world must act to restore democracy, either through sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or, if necessary, something more direct. That's the story. And on the surface, it's compelling. The data from the opposition's parallel vote count, compiled by independent observers, does suggest that Gonzalez won by a significant margin. The images of protesters clashing with security forces are real. The economic collapse under Maduro is undeniable. And the U.S. has a long history of intervening in Latin America when it suits its interests. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not wrong, exactly. It's just incomplete. And in geopolitics, what you leave out is often more important than what you include. Here's what they're not telling you. First, the election wasn't just about Maduro versus the opposition. It was about Venezuela's place in the world and whether the country will remain a client state of Russia and China or return to the U.S. sphere of influence. Maduro knows that if he loses, he doesn't just lose power, he loses his lifeline. Since 2019, when the U.S. imposed crushing sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry, Russia and China have stepped in to fill the void. Rosneft, the Russian state-owned oil giant, has been buying Venezuelan crude at a discount and reselling it on the global market, often through shadowy intermediaries. China, meanwhile, has extended billions in loans to Caracas, secured by future oil deliveries. These aren't acts of charity. They're strategic investments. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. And in a world where energy is power, control over Venezuela's oil is a geopolitical prize worth fighting for. Second, the U.S. response to the election wasn't just about democracy. It was about deterrence. For years, the Biden administration has been trying to walk a fine line in keeping Maduro isolated enough to weaken him, but not so much that he collapses entirely and hands the country over to Russia and China by default. The problem? That strategy has failed. Maduro hasn't fallen. He's dug in. And now, with the election results in dispute, the U.S. faces it: accept a fraudulent outcome and risk looking weak, or double down and risk a confrontation with Moscow and Beijing. Third, and most importantly, the crisis in Venezuela is no longer just a Latin American problem. It's a global one. Russia has already signaled that it will not accept a US-backed regime change in Caracas. In the weeks leading up to the election, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned that any attempt to overthrow the legitimate government would be met with a decisive response. China, too, has made its position clear. In a rare joint statement with Russia in June, Beijing declared that external interference in Venezuela's internal affairs is unacceptable. That's diplomat speak. If the US moves against Maduro, we will move against the US. Now, let me tell you what's really happening here. The US is being drawn into a trap, and it's one of its own making. For the last 2 decades, American foreign policy has operated on the assumption that the US can maintain its dominance in the Western Hemisphere through a combination of economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and, when necessary, military force. That playbook worked in the 20th century, when the US could overthrow governments in Guatemala, Chile, and AMA with little pushback. But the world has changed. Russia and China are no longer regional powers. They're global ones. And they've made it clear that they will not tolerate another US-orchestrated regime change in their backyard. The problem is that the US foreign policy establishment hasn't caught up to this reality. They still think in terms of unipolarity, the idea that the US can act as the world's policeman, intervening wherever it sees fit. But we're living in a multipolar world now, where power is diffused among multiple actors, and where the old rules of engagement no longer apply. The US can't just sanction Venezuela into submission anymore, because Russia and China will step in to prop up Maduro. It can't just threaten military action, because Moscow and Beijing will respond in kind. And it can't just assume that the Venezuelan people will rise up and do the work for them, because after 25 years of Chavismo, the country is deeply divided, and the opposition is fragmented. Here's where it gets interesting. The US has 3 options in Venezuela, and none of them are good. The first option is to accept Maduro's victory and try to negotiate some kind of power-sharing agreement. That's the diplomatic route. The problem? Maduro has no incentive to negotiate. He survived sanctions, coup attempts, and mass protests. He knows that if he gives an inch, the opposition will take a mile. And even if he did agree to a deal, the US would have to lift sanctions, a move that would be politically toxic in an election year, especially in Florida, where Venezuelan exiles wield significant influence. The second option is to double down on the current, keep the sanctions in place, recognize González as the legitimate president, and hope that economic pressure and internal dissent force Maduro out. That's the status quo approach. The problem? It hasn't worked in 6 years, and there's no reason to think it will work now. Maduro has proven remarkably resilient. He's purged the military of potential rivals, co-opted the judiciary, and used oil revenues to buy off key constituencies. And with Russia and China backing him, he's not going anywhere. The third option is the one that keeps me up at: military intervention. Not a full-scale invasion, necessarily, but something more limited: a naval blockade, airstrikes on key infrastructure, or even a covert operation to arm and train opposition forces. That's the hawkish approach. And it's the one that could push Venezuela from a crisis into a catastrophe. Let me be, I'm not saying the US will intervene militarily. But I am saying that the pressure to do so is growing. And if it happens, it won't be because the US wants to restore democracy. It will be because the US foreign policy establishment has convinced itself that Venezuela is a vital national interest, one that justifies the risk of a direct confrontation with Russia and China. That's a dangerous miscalculation. Because here's the thing about it's not just a country. It's a geopolitical tripwire. And if the US crosses that line, it won't just be fighting Maduro. It will be fighting Russia and China, too. Let's out for a moment and look at the bigger picture. The crisis in Venezuela is just one front in a much larger struggle for global dominance, a struggle that pits the US against a rising axis of revisionist powers that want to rewrite the rules of the international order. Russia wants to reassert its influence in its near abroad. China wants to displace the US as the world's leading superpower. And both see Venezuela as a critical piece of that puzzle. From a realist perspective, this makes perfect sense. Venezuela is a resource superpower. It has the largest oil reserves in the world, vast deposits of gold and rare earth minerals, and a strategic location that gives it access to both the Caribbean and South America. For Russia, control over Venezuela means leverage over global energy markets. For China, it means a foothold in the US's backyard. And for the US, losing Venezuela means losing its grip on the Western Hemisphere, a development that would have profound implications for American security. But here's the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon it was in the 1990s. Its military is stretched thin. Its economy is burdened by debt. And its political system is deeply polarized. Meanwhile, Russia and China have spent the last 2 decades modernizing their militaries, extending their global reach, and forging alliances with like-minded states. They're not the Soviet Union or Maoist China. They're sophisticated, patient, and ruthlessly pragmatic. And they're playing a long game, one that the US seems increasingly ill-equipped to counter. Now, let's talk about the military dimension of this crisis, because that's where things get really dangerous. The US already has a significant military presence in the region. There are roughly 1,000 US troops in Colombia, another 1,000 in Honduras, and a rotating contingent of special forces in Guyana. The Navy's Fourth Fleet, which was reactivated in 2008 to counter growing Russian and Chinese influence in Latin America, has been conducting regular patrols in the Caribbean. And in the last year, the US has stepped up its military cooperation with Brazil, Ecuador, and Peru, all countries that share a border with Venezuela or have a stake in its stability. But here's the US military is not invincible. And in Venezuela, it would be operating in a highly complex environment. The Venezuelan military, while poorly equipped, is large and battle-hardened. It has been fighting insurgencies and drug cartels for years. And it has the backing of Russia and Iran, both of which have provided training, weapons, and intelligence support. Then there's the terrain. Venezuela is a vast country with dense jungles, towering mountains, and sprawling urban centers. It's not Iraq or Afghanistan, where the US could rely on air superiority and overwhelming firepower. It's a place where a conventional military campaign could quickly turn into a quagmire. And that's before we even get to the risk of escalation. If the US were to launch airstrikes on Venezuelan soil, Russia and China would almost certainly respond. They might not do so directly, at least not at first. But they could provide Maduro with advanced air defense systems, send military advisors to Caracas, or even deploy their own forces to the region under the guise of protecting their citizens. They could also retaliate in other theaters, Ukraine, Taiwan, the South China Sea, where the US is already stretched thin. Let me put this in perspective. The last time the US intervened in Latin America on this scale was the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a disaster that nearly triggered a nuclear war. The last time the US tried to overthrow a government backed by Russia and China was in Syria, where it got bogged down in a decade-long conflict that ended with the US being forced to withdraw. And the last time the US tried to impose regime change through sanctions was in Iraq, where the result was a humanitarian catastrophe and a power vacuum that gave rise to ISIS. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And if the US isn't careful, Venezuela could become the next chapter in a long and tragic story of American overreach. But the military risks are only part of the equation. There's also the domestic political dimension to consider. In an election year, foreign policy is never just about foreign policy. It's about politics. And in the US, Venezuela has become a wedge issue, one that both parties are using to rally their bases. For the Biden administration, the crisis in Venezuela is a chance to show that it's tough on dictators. That's why you're seeing a coordinated response from the White House, the State Department, and Congress. It's why Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been making the rounds on cable news, condemning Maduro's fraudulent election. And it's why you're hearing whispers about a potential naval blockade, a move that would play well with voters in Florida, where the Venezuelan exile community is a powerful political force. But here's the Biden administration is also trying to avoid a full-blown crisis. It knows that a military confrontation with Russia and China would be a disaster. And it knows that the American public is war-weary after 2 decades of failed interventions in the Middle East. So it's trying to thread the ramping up the rhetoric, tightening the sanctions, but stopping short of anything that could spiral out of control. The Republicans, meanwhile, are pushing for a much harder line. Donald Trump, who has been critical of Biden's handling of Venezuela, has suggested that the U.S. should take the oil if Maduro refuses to step down. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a potential 2024 contender, has called for a naval blockade. And Senator Marco Rubio, a key voice on Latin American issues, has warned that the U.S. is running out of time to act. This is where things get dangerous. Because in an election year, foreign policy decisions are often driven more by domestic politics than by strategic considerations. And if the Biden administration feels like it's losing ground to the Republicans on Venezuela, it might be tempted to take a more aggressive stance even if that means risking a wider conflict. So where does this leave us? What happens next in Venezuela? Let me lay out 3 possible scenarios, along with my best estimate of their likelihood. Scenario 1, the diplomatic off-ramp. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies accept Maduro's victory but push for a negotiated transition, one that would see Maduro step down in exchange for sanctions relief and guarantees of immunity. This would require a level of diplomatic finesse that the U.S. hasn't demonstrated in years. It would also require Maduro to believe that he has more to gain from stepping down than from staying in power. That's a tall order. But it's not impossible. If the U.S. were to offer a credible off-ramp, one that includes a phased lifting of sanctions and a role for Maduro in a post-transition government, he might take it. The problem? The opposition would almost certainly reject any deal that leaves Maduro in power, even temporarily. And the U.S. would face intense pressure from its allies in the region to take a harder line. Scenario 2, the frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies refuse to recognize Maduro's victory, but they stop short of military action. Instead, they double down on sanctions, recognize González as the legitimate president, and wait for Maduro to collapse under the weight of economic pressure. Meanwhile, Russia and China continue to prop up Maduro, turning Venezuela into a de facto client state. The country becomes a frozen conflict, a place where the U.S. and its adversaries engage in a low-intensity proxy war, with neither side willing to back down. This is the Syria model. And it's a recipe for long-term instability. Scenario 3, the escalation spiral. This is the nightmare scenario. In this scenario, the U.S. takes direct action against Maduro either through a naval blockade, airstrikes, or a covert operation to arm the opposition. Russia and China respond by increasing their military support for Maduro, possibly even deploying their own forces to the region. The conflict escalates, drawing in other actors: Colombia, Brazil, Cuba, Iran. And before long, Venezuela becomes the flashpoint for a wider war, a war that could spread beyond Latin America and into the global arena. Now, let me be none of these scenarios are good. The best-case scenario is a negotiated transition that leaves Venezuela with a stable, democratic government. But that's also the least likely outcome. The most likely scenario is a frozen conflict, one that turns Venezuela into a permanent battleground for great power competition. And the worst-case scenario is a direct confrontation between the U.S. and Russia and China, a confrontation that could have catastrophic consequences for the entire world. So what should the U.S. do? How should it navigate this crisis without making a bad situation worse? Let me offer a few recommendations, ones that I know will be controversial, but that I believe are necessary if we want to avoid a disaster. First, the U.S. needs to accept that Maduro is not going anywhere. At least not in the short term. He has survived sanctions, coup attempts, and mass protests. He has the backing of Russia and China. And he has a stranglehold on the military and the judiciary. The idea that the U.S. can force him out through economic pressure or diplomatic isolation is a fantasy. And the idea that it can do so through military force is a dangerous delusion. Second, the U.S. Second, the U.S. needs to stop treating Venezuela as a problem to be solved and start treating it as a reality to be managed. That doesn't mean recognizing Maduro's legitimacy, far from it. But it does mean acknowledging that the current policy of maximum pressure has failed, and that doubling down on it will only push Venezuela further into the arms of Russia and China. Let me explain why this matters. When the Trump administration imposed sweeping sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in 2019, the goal was cripple Maduro's regime by cutting off its primary source of revenue. And on paper, it worked. Venezuela's oil production, which had already been in decline, collapsed from 1.3 million barrels per day in 2018 to just 700,000 by 2020. But here's the uncomfortable: sanctions didn't topple Maduro. They just made him more dependent on his external patrons. Russia's Rosneft stepped in to help Venezuela evade sanctions, while China continued to buy discounted oil through back channels. Meanwhile, the Venezuelan people suffered. Hyperinflation soared to 1,000,000% in 2018, and millions fled the country. The sanctions didn't weaken Maduro, they weakened Venezuela. Now, what most people don't realize is that this dynamic isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader geopolitical chessboard. Every time the US tightens the screws on Maduro, it hands Russia and China an opportunity to extend their influence in Latin America. And they're taking it. In 2022, Russia deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela for joint military exercises, a move that sent shockwaves through Washington. China, meanwhile, has deepened its economic ties with Caracas, investing billions in infrastructure projects and securing long-term access to Venezuela's vast oil reserves. This isn't charity, it's strategic positioning. And the more isolated Venezuela becomes, the more it will rely on Moscow and Beijing for survival. Here's where the military implications get particularly dangerous. Venezuela's armed forces are one of the most heavily armed in Latin America, thanks in large part to Russian and Chinese weapons sales. Since 2005, Venezuela has purchased over $11 billion worth of military equipment from Russia, including Sukhoi fighter jets, T-72 tanks, and S-300 air defense systems. China, for its part, has supplied Venezuela with drones, radar systems, and even a satellite monitoring station. These aren't just symbolic purchases, they're force multipliers. And they're part of a broader pattern. Russia has been steadily increasing its military footprint in Latin America for years, conducting joint exercises with Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. China, too, has been extending its presence, establishing a space tracking station in Argentina and deepening its ties with the region's leftist governments. So what happens if the US decides to escalate? Let's say the Biden administration, under pressure from Congress or a future Republican administration, authorizes a naval blockade of Venezuela's coast. Russia and China would almost certainly respond. Moscow could send more military advisors to Caracas, or even deploy its own forces under the guise of protecting Russian citizens. Beijing, while less likely to send troops, could retaliate economically, perhaps by dumping U.S. Treasury bonds or imposing sanctions on American commies operating in China. And then there's the risk of miscalculation. In 2019, the U.S. nearly came to blows with Russia over Venezuela when 2 Russian military planes landed in Caracas with troops and equipment. The situation was defused, but it was a stark reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control. Now, I'm not saying the US should do nothing. But it needs to be smarter about how it engages with Venezuela. And that brings me to my third: the US should explore a limited détente with Maduro, not because he deserves it, but because it's the least bad option. This could mean easing some sanctions in exchange for concrete concessions, like allowing international observers to monitor elections or releasing political prisoners. It could mean reopening diplomatic channels, even if only at a low level. And it could mean working with regional partners like Colombia and Brazil to create an off-ramp for Maduro that doesn't involve a violent collapse. Here's why this: Venezuela is not just a humanitarian disaster. It's a geopolitical tinderbox. And if the US doesn't change course, it risks turning that tinderbox into a conflagration. The Cold War is over, but the logic of great power competition is back with a vengeance. And Venezuela is ground zero. If the US and its adversaries can't find a way to manage this crisis, it won't just be Venezuela that pays the price, it will be the entire world. Now, what most people don't realize is that the real battleground in Venezuela isn't just the streets of Caracas or the oil fields of the Orinoco, it's the fractured psyche of the Venezuelan state itself. The country isn't just collapsing, it's undergoing a slow-motion implosion of its political institutions, and the way that implosion plays out will determine whether we're looking at a manageable crisis or a full-blown regional catastrophe. Let me explain why this matters. The first thing to understand is that Nicolas Maduro isn't just a dictator clinging to power, he's the symptom of a much deeper dysfunction. Venezuela's political system was never as stable as it seemed, even during the Chavez years. The 1999 constitution, which Chavez rammed through with populist fervor, was designed to centralize power in the presidency, weaken checks and balances, and create a cult of personality around the leader. That worked for a while, especially when oil prices were high and Chavez could buy loyalty with petrodollars. But when the price of oil collapsed in 2014, the entire edifice started to crack. Maduro inherited a system that was already rotting from the inside, and rather than reform it, he doubled down on repression and patronage. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's opposition isn't just weak, it's divided, discredited, and, in some cases, complicit in its own marginalization. Take the 2018 presidential election, which Maduro won amid widespread allegations of fraud. The opposition was split between those who boycotted the vote and those who participated, and the result was a foregone conclusion. Then there's Juan Guaidó, the self-declared interim president who was recognized by the US and dozens of other countries in 2019. Guaidó had a moment, there's no denying that, but his strategy of relying on US sanctions and international pressure to force Maduro out backfired spectacularly. By 2020, his approval ratings had plummeted, and by 2021, even the Biden administration had quietly downgraded its support for him. The problem wasn't just that Guaidó failed, it's that the opposition as a whole has never been able to articulate a coherent vision for Venezuela's future beyond Maduro must go. And that's the crux of the issue. The opposition's inability to unite isn't just a tactical failure, it's a strategic one. Venezuela's political class, both Chavista and anti-Chavista, has spent the last 2 decades engaging in what I called performative politics. They've treated governance as a zero-sum game where the goal isn't to build institutions but to destroy the other side. The result is a country where the state has effectively ceased to function in any meaningful way. The judiciary is a rubber stamp for the executive. The legislature, when it's not being ignored, is a battleground for infighting. And the military, which has always been the real power broker in Venezuela, is a black box. No one outside of its inner circles knows who's really in charge or what their endgame is. Let me give you an example of how this plays out in practice. In 2020, Maduro's government arrested 2 American mercenaries, Luke Denman and Aaron Berry, who were part of a botched operation to capture Maduro and bring him to the US. The whole thing was a farce, poorly planned, poorly executed, and almost comically incompetent. But it revealed something: the Venezuelan military, which was supposed to be the backbone of the regime, was so fractured that a ragtag group of ex-Green Berets thought they could waltz into Caracas and overthrow the government. That's not just a failure of intelligence, it's a failure of the entire system. If the military can't even secure its own capital, what does that say about its ability to govern? Now, here's where things get really dangerous. The longer the stalemate drags on, the more likely it becomes that Venezuela's political crisis will spill over into its neighbors. Colombia, which has absorbed nearly 3 million Venezuelan migrants since 2015, is already struggling with the economic and social strain. Brazil, under Lula, has tried to walk a fine line between engaging with Maduro and keeping him at arm's length. But if Venezuela's economy collapses further, or if Maduro decides to lash out at his neighbors to distract from his own failures, both countries could be drawn into the conflict. And let's not forget Guyana, which is sitting on a massive oil reserve that Venezuela has claimed as its own. If Maduro decides to make a move on Essequibo, it could trigger a regional war. So what are the possible scenarios? Let's break them down. The first scenario is what I call the managed decline. In this scenario, Maduro remains in power, but his grip on the country weakens over time. The economy continues to stagnate, but it doesn't collapse entirely. The opposition remains divided, but it gains enough traction to force Maduro into negotiations, perhaps over elections or a power-sharing agreement. The US and its allies ease some sanctions in exchange for concessions, and Venezuela limps along as a dysfunctional but stable state. This is the best-case scenario, but it's also the least likely. Maduro has shown no interest in genuine negotiations, and the opposition has shown no ability to force his hand. The second scenario is the Sudan option. In this scenario, Venezuela fractures along regional and factional lines, with different parts of the country falling under the control of different armed groups. The military splinters, with some units remaining loyal to Maduro and others defecting to regional warlords or criminal syndicates. The economy collapses, and the country becomes a failed state, a haven for drug traffickers, mercenaries, and extremist groups. This is the nightmare scenario, and it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Venezuela already has one of the highest homicide rates in the world, and its prisons are controlled by gangs. If the state loses its monopoly on violence, it's not hard to imagine the country descending into chaos. The third scenario is the Cubanization of Venezuela. In this scenario, Maduro tightens his grip on power, but the country becomes increasingly isolated and dependent on foreign patrons: Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba. The economy doesn't collapse, but it stagnates, and the regime survives by exporting repression and importing just enough resources to keep the military and the elite happy. This is the most likely scenario, but it's also the most dangerous. A Cuba-style dictatorship in Venezuela would be a permanent thorn in the side of the US and its allies, and it would give Russia and China a foothold in the Western Hemisphere that they could use to project power for decades to come. Now, I know what some of you are: this is all very interesting, but what can the US actually do about it? The answer, unfortunately, is not much, at least not in the short term. The Biden administration has tried to walk a fine line between pressuring Maduro and engaging with him, but it hasn't worked. The sanctions have hurt the Venezuelan people more than they've hurt the regime, and the opposition is too weak to capitalize on the discontent. The truth is, the US has limited leverage over Venezuela, and the more it tries to force Maduro out, the more it plays into his hands. Here's what I think the US should do instead. First, it should stop treating Venezuela as a binary choice between regime change and appeasement. The goal shouldn't be to overthrow Maduro, it should be to create the conditions for a negotiated transition. That means working with regional partners like Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico to create a united front that can pressure Maduro without pushing him into a corner. It means offering carrots as well as sticks, like easing sanctions in exchange for free and fair elections or the release of political prisoners. And it means recognizing that the opposition, for all its flaws, is the only viable alternative to Maduro. Second, the US should stop outsourcing its Venezuela policy to Florida politicians. I'm talking about figures like Senator Marco Rubio, who has made a career out of grandstanding on Venezuela but has never offered a realistic plan for resolving the crisis. Rubio's approach, maximalist rhetoric, sanctions, and saber-rattling, hasn't worked, and it's not going to work. The US needs a Venezuela policy that's based on reality, not on domestic politics. Third, the US should start preparing for the worst. If Venezuela does collapse, the fallout will be catastrophic, not just for the region, but for the US as well. We're talking about millions more migrants, a surge in drug trafficking, and the potential for a proxy war between the US and its adversaries. The US needs to work with its allies to create contingency plans for a Venezuelan meltdown, including humanitarian aid, refugee resettlement, and, if necessary, military intervention to stabilize the country. But here's the: none of this will work unless the US is willing to accept that Venezuela is not just a problem to be solved, it's a reality to be managed. Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and the opposition isn't strong enough to force him out. The best the US can hope for is a slow, messy, and imperfect transition, one that avoids a violent collapse and keeps Venezuela from becoming a permanent client state of Russia or China. The alternative is unthinkable. If the US continues on its current path, sanctions, isolation, and regime change fantasies, it risks turning Venezuela into a failed state that drags the entire region down with it. And that's not just a Venezuelan problem, it's a global one. Because if Venezuela becomes the point of no return, it won't just be the Venezuelan people who pay the price. It will be all of us.